Welcome to episode 88 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning talking to you from my home here in London, England. If this is the first time you've listened to the podcast, the remit is all about preserving film history, really. So you can treat this and the 87 episodes that came before it as an archive of film history that can be used to listen to for your entertainment, for research material, for your book or podcast, or even essay. You have about an hour of film chat ahead of you, and I hope you enjoy it. If you're a regular listener, thanks as always for joining me and for your support. And thanks to the lovely people that already support the podcast via Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Benning. I really do need your help to keep this podcast going. And to make it financially viable, I need at least another 40 or so of you. So if you like my work and you buy me a pint or a coffee if we were to meet, then please consider supporting the podcast with just $12 for a whole year of episodes. There are several tiers to choose from on Patreon with several perks, including videos and merchandise. You can find all the details, as I said, at patreon.com/Jamie Benning. You can also support the podcast by buying some merchandise at filmumentaries.creator-spring.com. I'll leave that in the show notes. And there you can buy t-shirts, bags, bottles, and even socks with the Filmumentaries logo on it. I'll leave the links for the Patreon and the shop in the show notes, as I say. And if you can't support the podcast via either Patreon or on the store, please just share, like, subscribe, and leave a review of the podcast. This is a very small independent podcast. It's just me and my laptop, and I need all the help that I can get to spread the word, so thank you for your support. You can follow me on Twitter or X at JamieSWB, and on my profile there's a link tree to all my various sites, including my Vimeo channel, where you can find hours of video to watch for free on films like Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Jaws, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Back to the Future, and more. Okay, back to this episode, number 88. I spoke to Max Smith in June 2023 about the path he took to his career as Supervising Sound Editor and employee of Skywalker Sound via marching bands, a chance meeting with Walter Murch, being propelled into the industry working for Robert Zemekis, and so much more. So thanks to the folks at Skywalker Sound for helping set this up. And here's my interview with Supervising Sound Editor Max Smith. And I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So where did it all begin for you, Mac? Were you a family that went to the cinema a lot? Would your parents take you there?
Absolutely. I was going to the movies all the time from a very young age because I was the youngest child in our family, with a sister who's 9 years older and a brother who was 13 years older. So I felt like I was their age all the time and sort of being whisked along to go see things with them. I think I'm a similar age that you are. I was 3 years old when the original Star Wars came out and grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. There's a story that my parents were in bed reading at night, and my brother, who would have been 16, came running home and came into the bedroom and said, "Oh my gosh, there's this amazing movie, and the good guy wore white and the black guy wore black, and he was really bad." And you have to see this movie. So I think they all went and saw it at some point without me, and then decided that they should take me as well. And being 3, I don't have distinct memories of going to the theater. All I remember is them pointing at the black and white advertisement from the newspaper that they were going to take me to this movie. I don't know if it was my first film. No, my parents, it probably wasn't. But shortly after that, Star Wars really took over my life to a large degree. I just wanted to consume everything possible. So any making of books or anything that I could get my hands on, I would just devour, and including the toys. My mom fueled my obsession with the toys, which I still have a lot of them to this day with the original boxes. And yeah, it's just, like I said, it kind of, ruled the direction of where I was headed. And I just wanted to be part of movies. I didn't know exactly what part of movies that I wanted to be involved with, but I just remember sort of like pointing at the screen and like, I want to do that. Yeah, I would pore over the books and how they made the special effects and the pictures of like how they were inspired by Ray Harryhausen or Errol Flynn movies or things like that, and I just wanted to learn as much as I could. I became a early subscriber to Bantha Tracks, which was the Star Wars fan club newsletter, and it's funny, I didn't realize until a number of years ago that there was one issue of Bantha Tracks that actually came with a floppy record from Sprocket Systems that Ben Burt had put together. I think it was like sort of sound design suite that it was one of those such a floppy piece of vinyl that you had to put pennies on either side of the spindle to keep it on the turntable or keep it down because it was so lightweight. I think that's on YouTube somewhere. It's very funny.
So how did you then make the transition into the industry itself? Were you able to seek out a college that would lead you in that direction?
Well, I was always interested in being involved with filmmaking, but I didn't quite know exactly how to get there. In high school, I did a few things. They had a public access news program that you'd put on sort of a weekly show just talking about what's happening at our school. And I got involved with that class, and we would sort of take turns being talent on camera, being behind the scenes. And I really liked directing that show. I felt like that was the place that made sense for me. So I kind of cut my teeth in that as well as experimenting with video cameras at home and doing very rudimentary VHS to VHS editing. I landed a internship at the local ABC television station in the engineering department. I was not, a super technical kid, but it was just sort of getting my foot in the door. So I learned about the different departments of a newscast, and watching that happen live was very interesting and enlightening, and seeing broadcasts that went well and some that went not so well.
Yeah.
And a lot of the expletives behind the scenes that the audience at home didn't hear. And I got to run the studio cameras periodically here and there. They had sort of like a summer period where they would let the full-time workers go off for a few weeks. And so we would step in and cover their shifts. So that was interesting, but it also taught me that I did not want to work in live TV.
I had that same feeling when I went to college, and then I ended up in live TV. But it is important, isn't it, to do those things, to kind of realize what you don't want to do, to point you in the direction of what you do want to do.
Absolutely. And part of it was also seeing some people who had been there for a lot of years and were not very happy people. And so that was sort of a telltale sign right there. I remember, I think it may have been when I was 16, sitting in the basement playing video games at home, probably Nintendo or something, and my mom dropped an application in my lap. And I was like, what is this? And it was an application to USC Summer Production Workshop in Southern California. And I kind of looked at her and said, really? And like, if I got in, I could do this? And she said, yeah, fill it out. So I filled out the application and sent it in, and I found out that I got in. So the summer when I was 17, this would have been 91, my parents drove me from Omaha, Nebraska, which is right in the middle of the United States, to Los Angeles, passing through New Mexico, where my sister was living, and Arizona, where my brother was living at the time. And we got to Los Angeles to USC, and they got me all settled, and then they hopped in a plane and went home. So they left me with the family car in Los Angeles for 6 weeks when I was 17. And it was just an amazing experience. It was kind of just a crash course in filmmaking, not actually using physical film, but using SVHS format. And we had to shoot 3 short projects from, write them, cast them, shoot them, edit them, and present them and I just had a blast. I felt like it was exactly what I wanted to do. And at that point, I had my sights set on USC to go to school. But I also talked to one of the professors there and really got his advice. And he was saying, in order to become a good filmmaker, you need to go live life. You need to get out there and travel and have different experiences and have things to say. And of course, being 17, you're kind of like, huh? I just want, just let me make movies. So I went home and continued school. I did apply to USC, but I did not get in, unfortunately. But I decided to go to the University of Iowa, which is in Iowa City. It's almost exactly halfway between Omaha, where I grew up, and Chicago, Illinois, right on Interstate 80, about a 3.5-hour drive, either to Chicago or to Omaha. And I spent a number of years at Iowa. They had not really a full-fledged film school, but they had a communications department that had sort of an emphasis on film. So I landed in Iowa, and the other part of my background, which I haven't talked about yet, was music. Music was a huge part of my family. I actually come from a family of tuba players, believe it or not. My father played tuba in college and various other bands in Nebraska. And then my older brother and older sister both played tuba. So when I was in about 4th or 5th grade, when in American schools, it's sort of, if you want to be in band, it's time to pick an instrument. My father said, you can pick any instrument you want, but we have 3 tubas in the basement. Like, hint, hint. And yeah, I really wanted to be a drummer, but I sort of listened to his wisdom, and part of it was an instrument like drums or trumpet. There's a lot of competition. Everybody's wanting to play that, where every band is desperate for a tuba player. You're going to have a lot more opportunities as a tuba player. So I was in band through elementary school, junior high, high school, did marching band, jazz band, concert band. And then my parents were involved with the Omaha Symphony. My dad was on the board, and they were also involved with this Omaha Press Club show, which was a gridiron show that would happen once a year, where they would play sort of parodies of famous tunes, but all based on politics of the city and the state. And so I got sort of embroiled with musicians, because we would have parties at the house, and we had a baby grand piano, and seeing people gather around the piano and sing songs and have great time. So I loved music. And not only did I play tuba, but I played bass guitar. And so I went off to college knowing that I wanted to do filmmaking, but I had this big musical background. So first thing I did when I landed in Iowa was I joined the marching band. And this is a Big Ten marching band. It's 250 to 300, college kids. And it was an instant sort of club and group. And there were parties every night. We actually traveled to Newark, New Jersey to play in the Kickoff Classic in Giants Stadium before classes even started my freshman year. They were flying me across the country. And so it was just like, wow, this is so much fun. I was not really a big sports fan, but just to be on the field and the energy with the huge crowd, and that was fun. So I was all in the marching band, and one of the guys in my section, who I played sousaphone, tuba, he was like, hey, I work at the college radio station, KRUI, you should come check it out. And also, not only was I a musician playing music, but I was also voracious as far as like just digesting music, and just loved all kinds of different obscure things. And so suddenly here's this college radio station where there's, thousands of CDs, thousands of vinyl records. And I was just like, oh my gosh, yes, I want to be part of the radio station. My buddy ended up taking over as his general manager and got me an overnight slot, DJing, I think, at 3 to 6 in the morning, which I was fine with, at the age of, 19 or 20.
Oh, you can handle it then, yeah.
Exactly. And I get to play, all my favorite things and learn about new music. And right at sort of that moment, my friend who was a manager, had some extra money in the fund for the radio station to spend on a very new, somewhat primitive, but digital audio editing piece of software called Deck 2, which was kind of a precursor to Pro Tools. And so when I showed up, it was all analog still with splicing, 1/4-inch tape, and there were cart machines, but suddenly there was this piece of software where you could record your voice into or digitize a piece of music, and you could chop it up and move it around and reverse it and add some very primitive effects. And my mind was just blown. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So I kind of jumped in feet first to learn as much as I could about that software and just experimenting with it. There was a show happening at the radio station that a couple of older college students were doing. They called it advertorial infotainment, where they would sample all kinds of like slogans from advertisements and commercials, very short sound bites, like 4-second, 5-second, maybe 10-second, and one of them would be DJing music underneath, mostly sort of ambient or instrumental music, and the other one would be firing off samples just on a Mac computer, just on the Finder level, just like double clicking sound files, just sort of randomly, but it would come up with this sort of experimental hodgepodge of, in some ways it was almost like performance art, and I thought that was so cool, and so I wanted to do that stuff. So I started sampling things from movies and doing that kind of thing. Actually, all of this stuff kind of got me a little sidetracked from my studies, and my grades were not great because I was spending so much time at the radio station. I actually, the first class to sort of get into the film part of the communications part of the school was an intro to media production, where you had to do 3 different sections. You had to do like a live TV-like section, a field production section where you went out and shot something in the real world and put it together, and then the third was sound. And we did the live TV one first, and it was old hat because I had done that at high school with both in school with the cable program, and then also at this TV station. The field shooting one, I got very ambitious, and my buddy from marching band who had a metal band, I said, let's shoot a music video. So I spent, probably a good 2 weeks just shooting them, rehearsing in the basement of their house, in concert at a club, and then like out at a like old broken down farmhouse, like straight out of an Alice in Chains, type music video. And then painstakingly, on VHS tapes, or it may have been 3/4, I can't remember, cut this thing together with their studio track, like, rolling back, and is the guitar really in sync in this moment, and working overnight, and sort of blew everybody away in the class with that video. And then when it came time for the third section, audio, the TA who was teaching that class, it was all still analog audio. And by that time, I was like so down the digital path that I was like, oh, we could do this, project. I'll tell you what, I'm going to do it digitally and then just record it off onto the analog and turn it in that way. Well, I made a couple of mistakes. One was I didn't tell her I was doing that. And number 2, I actually, when it was time to dub it off, had lost the piece of a 1/4-inch tape that she'd given us. So I borrowed one from the radio station, but it was a different brand. So it was a telltale sign when I turned it in that something was wrong, and she was furious.
Right.
And I ended up getting a D in the audio portion of
wow.
intro to media production, which is pretty funny looking back.
It is funny.
But quick thinking on your part to think of the best and most sort of valuable way for you to do it at that point. I mean, there of course it is worth learning those disciplines that came before the digital age,
Absolutely.
which is surely what they're trying to teach you. But also I would have marked you up at least to a C for initiative.
Yeah, and in hindsight, yeah, I was a dumb kid, and I should have followed the rules, or at least told her what I was doing. But then that I was just sort of continuing down that path, college radio and doing all that stuff, and then I went one night to a friend's apartment, and they had videotapes of the DCI championships from 1994. And DCI is Drum Corps International, which is an umbrella organization for all of these, like, in essence, Olympic level marching bands.
Right. Okay.
So if you think of like the NFL as the umbrella organization for all these football teams, DCI was sort of, the head of this summer circuit of the best players. Right. And I had been a little frustrated with the college marching band that there were a lot of people who were in it just to party and not play well or march well. And I was like, oh, wow, this is an opportunity to like go all in. So I talked to a friend and decided that I had only 1 year of age eligibility because the cutoff is at 21 years old. So I decided to audition for this group out of Madison, Wisconsin, called the Madison Scouts, which were an all-male drum corps, and they just had like so much swagger, and they played Latin jazz, and it was just like, it was so incredible. And I was like, I'd be dumb to not go try to go for it and be in this group. And Madison was only about a 2 or 3 hour drive from Iowa, and went up there, and there were something like 40 spots open. No, sorry. 40 spots open, but there were 800 people trying out for those 40 slots. Wow. And even though they were based in Madison, Wisconsin, there were kids from actually all over the world who were trying to be in this elite group. So we had people fly in from England, from Japan, from the Netherlands to try to be in this group. And they were the best of the best. And these groups aren't affiliated with a university or a school at all. They're just totally independent. So I showed up. I had a prepared piece, and I was so nervous. I was like practically shaking, watching, all the people go in and out. And somehow, like maybe about a minute before they called my name, just all the nerves went away. And I was like, what do I have to lose? That they could say no. So I went in there with a lot of confidence. I didn't play. I played fairly well, but I think my confidence sort of impressed them, and they seemed like I would fit in. But unfortunately, the next day I just missed the cutoff. They filled the tuba slots, contra slots, and I was like the runner-up. So I went home thinking that I wasn't going to march that summer. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from the executive director saying somebody had dropped out, and if I wanted to join, I could. And so I jumped at I said absolutely. And that following summer was probably one of the hardest summers of my life, because I was practicing 9 hours a day in the extreme heat, sleeping on high school gym floors, traveling on charter buses overnight, and playing this 11-minute show on a football field where, for the first time, it's, in college, it's like you're playing on the football field, and most people are like, you're not paying attention. They're like, they're going off to the restroom or going and stand to go get a beer or whatever. But this was like, suddenly there's a stadium full of people, and they are like honed in on every move you're doing. And I was like, wow, like that. It was just goosebumps here. It was incredible. So that kind of proved to me, like, I was not the best, but I just worked hard and stayed in and hung in there. And it was an incredible summer. It was one of the best things I ever did in my life.
And that's got to put you in a position where, you happen to be so driven to do something like that, and you're being drilled through. I mean, I have a nephew who's, 18 now, and he did the marching band thing in high school, and I know he was in Texas, in 45-degree heat, or like 90, 100-degree heat, as you guys would have it. I couldn't believe what he was going through, and even that it was allowed to treat kids in that way. Yeah, he's come out the other side of this as a very disciplined, very driven kid who's, speaks Japanese now, wants to travel the world. It opens your eyes an experience like that, I'm sure, to what is possible for you.
Totally. It teaches you grit, and also, I've kind of been stupidly ambitious throughout a lot of my life. What's I'll just go for it. What's the worst that could happen? And it's gotten me a long ways. So I came back to school, and I ended up being the music director at the radio station. And then at some point, something sort of clicked in my head and said, like, wait a second. I'm doing this audio production that is cool, but somebody has to be doing that for film. There's got to be a connection. And so I just started kind of like poking around a little bit. And of course, I'd gone to see movies my entire life. I was at the theater, probably 7 or 8 times a month when I was a kid.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I knew movies like sounded cool and sounded incredible, but it didn't really sort of click that, oh yeah, somebody's got to be doing this and making all those choices and decisions. So I ended up buying a bunch of audio equipment at home and just sort of banging on it and trying to teach myself how to use it. And I was also sort of toying with well, do I want to do more music composition or audio? And so I bought a couple keyboards, and I was experimenting with sequencers. I was not very good, but I was just kind of like trying everything I could. Even like I really got into these scratch DJs from the Bay Area that sort of made a big splash in the mid to late 90s. They just fascinated me with like, wow, they have these vinyl records, and they're essentially manipulating sound by hand. It's almost like a musical instrument, but it's like they're almost unlimited choices because it depends what you have on the vinyl. So I experimented a bit with that. Again, I was not great at it, but I was just trying to sort of like figure out as much as I could. And I bought an early Pro Tools version of Pro Tools, which was not something that your average person purchased back then.
No,
but I
not
wanted
cheap, I would imagine.
No. And it's funny that like the first place, because at that point, DigiDesign was the company that made Pro Tools. It was before Avid became involved. They actually, like, you had to buy it from, based on your region. So in my region of Iowa, I was supposed to buy it from a place in Chicago, and there was really only one big sort of music store. And I called them up and said I wanted to buy Pro Tools, and they laughed at me, said, yeah, right, kid, and pretty much hung up on me. And didn't even say, like, would you be able to pay for it? So I ended up finding another place to buy it from, and just, played with it and experimented as much as I could. I ended up going to New York City for like a week-long sort of crash course in Pro Tools to learn that. But then I was like, I want to do sound for film. Well, what's the best way to do it? And I just happened to, a friend of a friend was going out to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania to shoot a short film. And I just said like, hey, I'd love to do the sound on your film. I know I've never done it before. It's kind of a big ask to say, hey, let me do the sound, even though I have no experience. She was kind enough to connect me with the directors, which were two sisters. And I talked to them on the phone a couple times, and they were very nice, but they were like, oh yeah, take the job. They called me up, I think about 2 weeks before the shoot, and said, we actually need a boom operator. We have a production sound mixer, but would you be willing to come out, sort of be a sound consultant and help, as a boom operator? And I said, sure, why not? So flew out to New York with a, crew that I really didn't know. And it was, they shot this film in the house they grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Right. And I think it was maybe a 4 or 5 day shoot. The the woman who was running the production sound was very crabby and did not have a lot of patience for me because I didn't know what I was doing. She would yell and scream at me like, you're holding the boom wrong. You're doing this. Do it like this. And
baptism of fire.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And I was, going with it. Because I wanted to learn. But I think because she was so sort of harsh with me, I got a lot of sympathy from the rest of the crew. So by the time it did all wrap up, they said, yes, you can do the post sound. So cool.
Was that Lynn's Wake, the first
Yep.
film that I see on your IMDb? Yeah.
Yep, that's the first one.
And then quite a leap from a short film with some, friend of a friend to working for Robert Zemekis on Castaway. I'm sure that, was there anything in between, or is IMDb a representation of that leap that did happen?
There's a little bit. So kind of what happened was sort of in the middle of Lynn's Wake, my fiance and I decided to make the move to Northern California from Iowa. My parents met in San Francisco in the 1950s, and they always set their sights on wanting to retire back in Northern California. So they had already moved to the Bay Area, and we had gone out to visit them a number of times. And I had spent a summer in Los Angeles, and I knew there were, a lot of sound jobs in Los Angeles, but I was like, I know Skywalker's in Northern California. My parents are already out there. Let's make that big move and see if we can make it work. And I think we kind of gave ourselves like a timetable of maybe 2 years. If I can't get my foot in the door and get some work in the 2 years, we'll move to Los Angeles. So that was July of 99. We made the big trek, and I was finishing up the sound on Lynn's Wake at home, but then I was so naive. I'm like, is it in the newspaper? They're, classified ads for like, hey, we need a sound editor. I had no idea. So I ended up just kind of calling various recording studios around the Bay Area to find out, if there was any work for someone like me. I didn't get, a lot of people hanging up on me, but there were not a lot of opportunities until I came across a smaller studio in San Francisco called Outpost. And I got an internship there, and they were a facility that, they're still there actually. They did a little bit of everything. So yes, they did a little bit of independent film work, but they were doing recording for like Wells Fargo voice prompts. They were, just kind of, you name it. They were kind of we'll help you with whatever kind of, smaller scale sound thing. So it was nice, to get that opportunity. But I was also like at home, I felt like I had a good handle on Pro Tools, and they were not letting me touch Pro Tools there. They were definitely like keeping me back. They were like, go coil some cables or set up these microphones or whatever, which is fine. It's I didn't have a lot of experience, but I, kept being very ambitious, like trying to figure out what the next, thing was. And it was obvious after a few months that they were not going to sort of give me those opportunities. But I hung in there for a bit, and by total accident, I came across an ad online. This is, early 2000, that there's a sound design seminar featuring Walter Murch happening in Iowa City, where I had moved from 9 months prior.
Wow.
And it was not only Walter Murch, but Randy Tom, Dave Stone, who was a sound designer on Predator. There were a lot of heavy hitters, and they were sort of pitching the seminar as, here are practitioners, and then here's a group of people who are film scholars who study sound, and we're sort of putting the two groups together. And so I talked to my wife, and I'm like, or she was my fiance at the time. We were about to get married, and said, yeah, we don't have a lot of money, but I think I should fly back for this, sleep on a friend's couch. And she agreed. So I flew back to where I'd spent the last number of years at school, and showed up for this seminar. And opening piece of the seminar was Walter Murch, dissecting Apocalypse. It was just like, wow, this is incredible.
Yeah.
And then the next day is Walter at the local sort of like Cineplex just off campus, like at 9 a.m. dissecting Touch of Evil and the work he had done that, and playing not only the original cut, but then like going back and forth, like, let me play you the first 10 minutes of the original cut, and let me play you the first 10 minutes of the recut that I did based on Wells' memo. And it was, so fascinating. Of course, like 3 hours in, we'd only gotten about 35 minutes into the film before they kicked us out because they needed to open for real business. But I ended up like becoming sort of the de facto tour guide for this group, because there were maybe only about 30 people that flew in from out of town for the seminar. So it was a pretty intimate seminar, but it was time for lunch, and they would all kind of look at each other. Well, we don't know where to go, and I'd say, "Oh, let me take you this way. If we walk up this street and take a right, there's a pretty good Italian restaurant, and there's such and such is really good." So people kind of like got to know me because I was the de facto tour guide there. So by the time the seminar was kind of wrapping up, I knew both Walter and Randy were living and working in the Bay Area, and I said, "Hey, I actually live in the Bay Area and I want to get into film sound," and they were both kind enough to give me their email addresses.
Oh, great.
So when I came back, I was still working as an intern at Outpost, but I was emailing Randy and Walter, and I think Walter responded pretty quickly and said, "Why don't you come down to the Zoetrope facility, just to sort of on the edge of North Beach and Chinatown in San Francisco, and come hang with me for a little bit while I'm working." Well, I didn't know that he was working on Apocalypse Now Redux. So I come in and he walks me down to the basement studio where they recorded a lot of the original music for Apocalypse. And I'm sitting there, just the two of us, in the dark while Walter is screening French plantation dailies. And I'm just like, blah, 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 like, is this even real? Like, somebody pinch me. He was very kind and very gracious. There wasn't really an opportunity to work with him. But I was very thankful to meet him and have that time. Randy was a little harder to reach at that time because I think he was in the midst of finishing What Lies Beneath. But we played email tag, and I wasn't emailing him every day. It was maybe every 2 weeks or so. And he finally said, "Why don't you come out to the ranch and have lunch with me?" And so I drove out to the ranch for the first time, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is surreal. My whole, childhood, is based on Star Wars, and now I'm driving onto the property that, that George Lucas owns, and again, somebody pinched me. And Randy had his son Austin there, who I think was probably maybe in his early to mid-teens, and he met me out in the parking lot with Austin, and we walked over to the fitness center where they serve lunch, and I think he did tell me later on another day that he noticed how kind I was to his son, and that sort of made an impact. So he asked me before I departed that day, "Would you like to come out here 2 or 3 days a week in the afternoon to intern with me? I'm starting work on a film called Castaway."
Wow.
And I was like, absolutely. Yes.
I mean, already I'm kind of almost mentally noting here the things that have got you into this position. One of them you just mentioned is being a good person, which is always great. You want to work with good people that are kind and, good team players. You also are very open to opportunity by the sound of things. I think a lot of people let those things slide, by. It's that sliding doors thing, isn't it? Oh, should I have done that? Should I? Better to regret of, doing something and it not working out than not doing it. And
totally.
And also just kind of having that interest in something that leads you in those directions as well. Something that you're kind of passionate about, something you have an interest in, even if you don't know specifically what that interest is. Even if it's a kind of broad interest, just feeling your way around that room, that wall, if you like, until you find that sweet spot. And it sounds like, to land on a Zemeckis film, as an apprentice sound designer, that's got to be up there for anybody trying to get into the industry. That's a huge leap.
Absolutely, and I do credit my parents for so much of my success because number one, they were very supportive with whatever I was interested in. Mm-hmm. They would say like, "Oh, you want to learn about that? Let's figure that out." And that also just, having much older siblings and having my parents like to entertain a lot, so I was around adults a tremendous amount when I was a kid. So I learned to talk to people and learned how to sort of fit into a situation and how to sort of spark conversation. But yeah, Castaway was pretty crazy because suddenly I was coming to the ranch. I let Outpost know that I was leaving there. I think I spent another 2 weeks there to fill in, and then I became sort of focused on working at Skywalker. And Randy had me, mostly sitting on the back couch, kind of observing what he was doing, but he also asked me to help him locate some things to record for the show. And this was a very unique kind of film, I'm sure, as you know, because number one, he's stranded on this island, and they had already decided there's going to be no music during this whole sequence on the island. And Zemeckis had set up very strict rules that he didn't want the sounds of insects or birds, because he didn't want it to sound like a paradise. He wanted it to sound very lonesome because he didn't want the audience members to go like, "Oh, I wouldn't mind spending, being isolated on this island." So that really limited Randy's sort of palette to water and wind and, the things that water and wind are interacting with, and Foley, and there's very little dialogue. And he knew that he needed things like palm fronds and different things to record various textures with. So I went to a nursery in San Francisco to get sort of their clippings that they'd clipped off, like sort of these are the weaker fronds that we're just going to dispose of. Of course, the first day they were like, "Oh yeah, no problem, you could take those." And then the second time I showed up, they kind of looked at me like, "Now what is this for?" and started asking for payment,
right?
Which was fair. But the other thing that he wanted me to go get were these young coconuts, which, if you're familiar with the movie, Tom Hanks' character finds these giant green coconuts and he's having a hard time getting into them. And so Randy wanted to go find those coconuts so we could record around the ranch, dropping and hitting and smashing. And it was like, sure, no problem. So I go off to the grocery store, down in San Rafael. Those coconuts are not in the produce aisle. So I came back empty-handed, and somebody, it may have been Randy's assistant at the time, told the picture department that we were having trouble locating these. And I think the post supervisor called around and found an Asian store in San Rafael and said, "Oh, they have them. Go down there." And I said, "Okay." So I made the trek down. Well, I asked for the young coconuts, and it was just the young coconut meat, with just like saran wrapped, husk. And so again, I came back empty-handed, and this person, when they found out that I didn't get them, they were screaming. I mean, not somebody from Skywalker, it was somebody on the picture side. And I was like, no, they had them, but they weren't appropriate to record. I ended up going to the wholesale produce market in San Francisco at like 5 a.m. and asked a bunch of the people there, and they're like, "Oh, no, those, we don't get those typically. They may come in once or twice a year." And so I told Randy, I think it's a dead end. And he said, "Well, go to the store and buy some other things that you think would sound like that." So I ended up going to Whole Foods and buying different sized melons and hard shell coconuts and acorn squash and butternut squash. And so we spent an afternoon recording and hitting and smashing these different things. A few weeks later, somebody was able to actually ship some from Hawaii, which we recorded, but Randy decided, and I think I have this story correct, that the acorn squash sounded more realistic than the real thing, which was a lesson for me right there, that it's not necessarily the real thing that sounds the best.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I think people have an assumption with sound that it's either recorded on set or it is the sound of that thing they're looking at in some shape or form. But as a sound designer, you have to, having spoken to several sound designers now, I'm sure, I've taken this on board, that you have to think very much outside the box sometimes as to what might be the appropriate sound for that. Because if anybody out there is listening who's tried to edit sound into one of their projects, you soon realize the true artistry is not at your fingertips when you begin, because it sounds so out of place and it sounds so ridiculous and fake. There's an absolute art to it, and it sounds like by this time you're very much on the way to reaching that.
The other funny anecdote from Castaway is a lot of the production dialogue that was shot in Fiji was unusable because, number one, there were lots of insects, which Zemekis didn't want, or the surf was too loud, or they actually lost maybe a sound package or maybe a camera in the surf at one point. So there's not a lot of dialogue on the island, but when they had Tom Hanks record his dialogue in an ADR studio, which is very dead and dry, and of course didn't sound like the island. We had some time, and the supervising sound editor who was working with Randy, Dennis Leonard, he had an idea that let's go worldize Tom Hanks' dialogue, which worldizing is a term that Walter Murch used on American Graffiti, where they would re-record the sound of these songs in an environment, like in a back alley or something. So what Dennis wanted to do was to, back behind the tech building, there's a little tiny canyon, and he wanted to set up a big PA system and have Tom Hanks ADR recordings of him screaming for help shoot out and sort of bounce around the canyon and re-record it so it sounded like it was coming from that environment. Of course, they discovered that the birds were too loud out there when they set it up, and Bob didn't want any birds. So they said, hey, Mac, come out back with your Jeep and sit in your car near where we're recording, and we'll cue you. So we'll hit record, we'll cue you, you lay on your horn and scare the birds for about 10 seconds, and we'll fire off Tom Hanks' dialogue. And so they cue me, beep, beep, and then you hear, help! Somebody! Anybody! Okay, and they'd cue me up and do it again. After about the fourth or fifth time, we hear tires squealing, and it's ranch security fishtailing up the road because they think somebody is screaming for help back behind the tech building, like they're injured. And so we were told to, cease then, and, you can't do these things without letting us know, and such and such. So it was very funny. It's a story.
More learning.
Story that Dennis loves to tell to this day.
You mentioned, of course, that you kind of grew up as a Star Wars fan, and I think was the first project you worked on involving Star Wars the Knights of the Old Republic game. I remember playing that game. I'm trying to remember what system I would have had it on, but I remember playing that. It was the second one, wasn't it? Yeah.
I believe so.
The Sith Lords, yeah.
Yeah, so I just to give you a little context of before I got into the video games, so I continued with Randy on a couple more projects as his apprentice intern, and then he ended up going off to England to work on Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, which I was able to help him a little bit with prior to him leaving, but I was not in the budget or allowed to go to England, unfortunately. And he was away for 6 months. So suddenly it was like my one opportunity at the ranch. The person I know who has worked for me is gone. So suddenly I was, not at the ranch, not doing much sound work. trying to sort of figure out how to maneuver, and ended up working on a couple of freebie and low budget projects, and just was trying to meet more people. And I ended up meeting this guy, Nick Peck, who had been a sound designer at LucasArts.
Right.
That did a lot of the Star Wars Lucasfilm video games. And he had been up at the ranch working on a couple of projects, and he and I got along great. And he let me know that he was maneuvering to try to figure out how to start a video game sound division at Skywalker. He was not really happy with how things were going at LucasArts for various reasons, and was trying to get this off the ground, and took a lot of maneuvering, but he finally sort of made some headway to start this division. And I decided, I really want to be a part of that. I love video games, I love sound, I love Star Wars. And I knew that he was gonna have me come down to LucasArts to meet his boss and another sound designer down there. And I knew that they were going to ask me, what's your favorite video game? What do you think sounds the best? I hadn't, I think, bought a video game console for probably at least 5 years. And I, had been so focused on just trying to, get into sound for movies that I, sort of abandoned my video game hobby. And so I decided, I should go rent an Xbox and get some games and just do a crash course. And Hollywood Video and Blockbuster for years you could rent an Xbox or a PlayStation or whatever. And sort of right at the time that I showed up to do that policy had stopped. They no longer did that. And I was like, oh, crap. So I went to Costco, the discount warehouse place that we were members of, bought an Xbox brand new, and then went to the rental store and rented 10 games and pretty much spent a week playing as much as I could. So in the interview, I could sound educated about all these things. And I was right. They fired off all these questions to me. It was Nick. I can't remember his boss's name. And then David Collins was the third person there, who's a famous sound designer, voice actor, composer, does the soundtrack show. Yeah. And he and I are really good friends now. So I did well at the interview. I got the gig, and I ended up returning the Xbox to Costco because I couldn't afford it at the time. And started, they weren't quite ready for me to start working on the episode 3 video game. So I sort of just helped on a couple of those other titles. I wasn't on very long on Knights of the Old Republic. And I can't remember the other title. Republic Commando, I think, was the other one that I did a little bit of work on. But suddenly I was at the ranch with a much longer term gig. So I was on the episode 3 video game for, I think, almost 9 months. And our first child had just been born. So, definitely desperate to start making some income. And then being at the ranch for that period of time, I really got to meet a lot more of the people, and going to lunch and people recognizing my face and going, oh, yeah, this guy's, not too bad to hang out with. So that was a really sort of critical time for me to get known around the ranch, because all of the creative jobs at Skywalker Sound are project to project. There's almost nobody here on the creative side that is, sort of salary or guaranteed hours. So because of that period of time working on those games, I got my first assistant job on a film feature, and that was huge. But working on Star Wars was a dream come true, because it was this is incredible, and I was working on the cutscenes for the episode 3 game, and there were a huge number of cinematics. It was something like 70 or 80, plus at the very end we found out that there was going to be something like 15 minutes of live action content from the films.
Right.
that were going to be released in the game. And the game was coming out 2 weeks before the movie did.
Right, okay.
So this was sort of the incentive for people to buy the game, was get a glimpse of the movie before it comes out in theaters. So I actually had to get the gumption up to knock on Ben Burtt's door to say, like, hey, I know you're still working on this movie, but I have these scenes. Do you have any sounds for us that we can put in the thing? And I remember walking to his office for the first time, and it was like a museum, just all this incredible stuff from his history. I remember sitting on the couch and turning behind me, and there were the sheets for the Yub Nub song for Return of the Jedi that he had written out sort of phonetically for the singers to sing, and I was just like, it was crazy. Again, one of those moments where I had to pinch myself. Yeah, it was pretty crazy.
And working within that kind of library of sounds there, particularly in the Star Wars library of sounds, you're kind of in a world that already exists, yet you've got to kind of build upon that. But then I noticed as well that you've worked on a lot of animation movies where really you're starting from scratch. Surely there's no on-set sound, of course. Do you find that discipline of having to start from a clean slate to be more rewarding than maybe using a sound library that already exists in a franchise?
I mean, they're all challenging. Like Star Wars, there's such a high bar for what people are expecting, with all those signature iconic sounds that are truly incredible and people know instantly. So there's a lot of pressure on those projects to make it sound right. And then if you are building other things, that it fits within that sonic universe. But yeah, like working on a brand new piece of say animation that has no existing universe, I mean, that can be daunting too, but it can also be very freeing that there aren't as many rules. I mean, one of the things with animation that I think a lot of people don't realize is the people who've been working on it, say like the picture editors in animation, have been living with it for years before we get it, and they've put a lot of temp sounds in the Avid or Premiere or whatever they're working in. And so there's a lot of sometimes there's a lot of Stockholm syndrome with those sounds. I mean, we of course love getting all of their sounds because it's definitely like clear direction of like what they want to hear, and sort of shows the peaks and valleys and what are the important sounds. And there's sometimes where we're utilizing their sounds, but then detailing things around them. But there are a lot of times, like I said, that they've been living with them for so long, but by the time we've come up with our palette and our version that we're proud of, they're so focused on what they're used to hearing that they can't sort of separate themselves from these new ideas.
Yeah.
Especially if they've had a audience screening and there's a sound that generated a laugh. Even if it was a terrible, low-quality sound recorded in the 1950s, they don't want you to replace it, even if we could put in something that's funnier. They're just so used to like, no, people laughed at that one. So we do our best to, accommodate in those situations.
And I'm sure as a sound designer that has been working for many years, you have a kind of a mental and a physical or digital library of sounds that instinctively whether they might work or not work on a film. But I'm sure there's a lot of experimentation in your job as well. How do you kind of ensure that you don't fall down, the experimentation rabbit hole? I mean, of course you have a deadline, but you also want to find something different and unique to give to this director.
Yeah, it's challenging. And that's a lot of ways what we do is fresh because every project is different. Every client is different. Animation, live action, horror films versus, comedies versus whatever. But I do find myself, and I'm in the start of a project right now, wanting to spend a lot of time experimenting. As Randy likes to say, don't be afraid of making mistakes. Just try to make all the mistakes at the front of the project. It's very hard to sort of like figure out when to stop that, creative experimentation and really sort of buckle down and get the cutting done.
Do you have a start point? Sorry to interrupt. Do you have a start point for that experimentation? Is it a matter of taking a sound that you already have and changing the speed or the pitch or something like that? Is that you kind of find your way through it?
Yeah, sometimes. The one project that is close to my heart is a horror film called Haunt, which is directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, who wrote A Quiet Place. And they did the film 65. I loved working on that project and just the opportunity of like, what does this haunted house sound like? So on that project, for example, I started, we have a giant sound library that we have access to at our fingertips, but I took the sort of the pitch speed slider and I slid it down from 100% to about 18%. And I wanted to just poke around the library and start listening to sounds at extremely slow and low pitch playback, and it definitely inspired a ton of ideas. Even taking things like power tools, that you have this sort of rhythmic thing, and then you slow them way down, and it suddenly becomes this eerie texture. So it really depends on what the project is asking for. We usually have meetings early on with the clients, the picture editor, director, maybe the producer, to figure out, what are their wishes about the project and what are, to sort of get an idea of the tone and what they're after. And so largely that direction will sort of point us to where to start. And something like Marvel, it's if it's something brand new and fresh, we can start fresh, but we also know the bar is set high, and whatever we create might live on in multiple series or films later. So keeping all that stuff in mind in the back of your head. But yeah, starting in a blank session is very daunting. It's like a blank canvas or like a blank piece of paper. It's like where do you start? And a lot of it is just like you got to throw paint of some kind on there to, even if it's wrong, just like throw it on there and start playing, because the more you play, the more it'll start telling you what it needs and what it doesn't need.
And does that sometimes include you leaving the studio and going out into the field again and recording something?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are you one of those people that always has a microphone in their bag just in case?
I try to. I'm not always as good as I should be about that stuff, but I do have a small recorder that I take around periodically. And if I don't, sometimes I'll just use my phone to grab something. Because the other thing I've found is, going out and recording new, fresh stuff is not just great to have something unique and your own, but it's also now you have a concrete memory tied to that experience. Yeah. And sometimes it's even something like, I have this appointment to go record this big machine at a factory, and you show up and the machine is terrible. It's not at all what you were expecting. And as you're leaving, there's something around the corner that's malfunctioning or dropping in a weird way on a piece of metal, and you go record that, and that sticks in your head of like when you're sort of in the hot seat on the mix stage and somebody's like, I want to sound like such and such. It's one thing to like, type glass break in the library and suddenly 12,000 glass breaks come up. But if I can go, oh my gosh, I remember that time I went to go record that car and there was this amazing glass break. I'm going to go hunt for that because I have that memory tied to it. And sometimes that ends up being so much more valuable.
Yeah. And all the time you're doing this, you're also trying to, as a supervisor, I'm sure you're kind of looking at the overarching sonic identity of the movie as well. It's not just a matter of isolating these particular sounds and then later the team who are re-recording and mixing it. You have to kind of think about the film's sonic identity throughout the project and make sure that, it's telling the story.
Absolutely. And on some projects, I find it's helpful to sort of make rules. Not that we have to completely stand by those rules, but it kind of like will set sort of a structure to start working in, and then learning on when to break those rules. For one example, the film 9 Days that I worked on, which largely takes place in one location, this house that's in the middle of this desert that has this giant wall of TVs. I wanted to make the house sound kind of oppressive for the lead character, because he had this baggage that was attached to him and made him the way he was. And the house was sort of almost like a physical representation of this character. And so having sort of this heaviness in the air was really helpful. But then we also decided, like, when we mix it, let's only keep the sounds on the screen of the ambience and the characters, the Foley and the talking, and really only sort of really open up the soundscape in very certain times, which creates that sort of dynamic that it's like, oh, suddenly something is different. Why is it different? Well, because something happened in the story that really changed. Also, having like all of those layers of sort of oppressive air and tone in the house then allowed us to really strip things down when there was a really intimate moment, and able to sort of pull away those layers without the audience really knowing, sort of like pulling a rabbit out of a hat, not seeing how we're doing it, but really, finding a way to make the audience sort of lean in and be sucked into the story even more than they would.
You sort of earn those moments. Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you, because in movies, we tend to strive for, complexity in all parts of filmmaking, whether it's visual effects or sound. How do you make sure that you're not overwhelming your audience sonically? Do you sometimes have to take a step backwards and say, look, we need to get rid of this, and this, and just sort of hone in on the core of what is needed?
Absolutely. It is so easy to overcut, sound, whether it's, for a certain event or, say it's a big spaceship battle and wanting to really cut every explosion, every blast, and every buy. I really sort of in those situations sort of try to channel my inner Gary Rydstrom, who's very good at you only need to be hearing, a couple things at once. Where is your eye going, or where do you want the eye to go for the audience? But oftentimes you have to cut a lot of those layers to then be able to know when to, okay, now I have all these things. Now let's figure out what's really important. And the hope is to make a lot of those decisions before it gets to the mix stage, but inevitably a lot of those decisions do end up happening in the mix once the full score shows up. And we had all these things for, this big supernatural event, but the score is in all those frequencies. And so suddenly there's a sonic clash, the sounds, the music, and the design are all taking up the same sonic real estate. So really trying to step back and pull those layers out and deciding, oh, we need something completely different there, or maybe we've established this thing already, we can pull back here and the audience won't notice that it's gone. Which is an amazing, Rydstrom and, a lot of the other veterans here at Skywalker are so good at that trick of, sort of establish it and get out, but your brain plays tricks on you that you think you're still hearing it, but you're not.
I interviewed Mark Mangini and Theo Green about Dune, was it last year or the year before? And we were talking a little bit about how their work kind of dovetails with the work of a composer in a film. And I another example of that recently was Daniel Pemberton's score on Into the Spider-Verse. It's half music, half sound design in a way. Do you find that you're now interacting more with composers on projects, or are they still two very separate worlds that just kind of dovetail towards the end when the mix happens?
I would love to be collaborating with composers more. Unfortunately, it's just super tricky time-wise. We all have our best intentions. There are some people that are able to, sort of carve out that time, and I envy them that they're able to have that sort of collaboration with the composer, Peter Albrechtsen, who's a Danish sound designer, he tries to get involved as early as possible and loves having those conversations and sending things back and forth. Just unfortunately on a lot of the projects that I work on, by the time we start and by the time the composers start, it's just a race to the finish line. And also when the picture is changing so much throughout the process, they're trying to balance, record the score as late as possible based on picture changes, and we're trying to race to the mix that hopefully we have an idea of what the music is doing based on demos that are coming to us from the picture department. But I wish there was more collaboration. Same with VFX. Wouldn't it be wonderful if VFX and sound could have more collaboration? But just the way that schedules are designed, it's just not it's not easy at this point. But I hope and wish that at some point in the future, we're able to make it sort of less assembly line and a little more sort of, getting involved early and really trying to collaborate and have different department heads spawn ideas which influence other ones, because I think ultimately that's going to make for a better end product.
I wonder if that will be led by technology change in the way that stagecraft has kind of brought VFX to the front end of a movie's production as well as the back end. I wonder if there will be a leap in technology somewhere within the sound world that might afford you that chance to set the intention and collaborate earlier on.
And I don't think it's necessarily a technology thing, because there have been stories of like the Russo brothers having Alan Silvestri put together like a 9-minute suite for Infinity War and Endgame that then they were able to sort of play on set for the actors or the camera folks. The story I heard was that Josh Brolin was wearing the spandex with all the ping pong balls on it, but he's supposed to be this sort of menacing character, but he didn't look very menacing in that outfit on set. But once they played the Thanos suite that Silvestri had composed, they were like, oh, and it influenced the camera operator to drop low and make him look much more oppressive and things like that. So I think there are opportunities for things, especially if there's something sound wise that actors need to respond to, like something off screen, screams or is, a dangerous sound. I think, there is potential for having sound designers or sound supervisors create, a preliminary version of those things and fire them off on set to get a natural reaction from the actors.
One of the other questions I wanted to ask you about, and I'm not sure if it really comes under your remit as a supervising sound editor, but it's a sound question. There was a time in movie making where the mix was done, it left the hands of those artists and went to the distributor, and it was theatrically shown, and that was about it before home movies, right? And then home movies come along and you've got to start thinking about different mixes. Then Laserdisc comes and DVD and Blu-ray comes. For how much of the time you're working are you considering things like how is this going to play in Dolby Atmos versus someone's iPad or iPhone? Is that something that you have to consider as you work through a project?
Absolutely. And especially on projects that we know are going straight to streaming that are going to skip theatrical. I've done 3 Marvel streaming shows and 1 Star Wars one. We definitely have to sort of keep in mind that people are going to be listening to it and literally thousands of different ways, depending on the device and the room that they're in, and is it hooked up correctly or is it not? So we can't, there's no way to really judge every single way that somebody's listening to it, but I do have a set of inexpensive speakers here in my sound design room So when I am sound designing for those streaming shows, periodically I will pipe a piece of sound design through those cheap speakers just to see, is it reading? Is it having sort of the same impact? And a lot of times the low end just completely goes away. So it really makes you, challenges you to find other frequencies that will read and will work on those things. And I've also learned that when we're in the mix and we've sort of made our first pass in the mix, to try to listen to it through headphones, to pipe it through a flat screen TV that has tiny speakers, maybe even play it through an iPhone, just, and not watch the whole thing, but kind of see how things are going. And I'm also, very aware of people complaining about losing dialogue in a lot of formats. And so that's always at the forefront of my mind, is like dialogue clarity. But it's a big challenge because there's so many factors, unfortunately, and there are a lot of factors, unfortunately, before it gets to us, whether it's poor recording on set or on location, not always the fault of the production sound mixer. Sometimes it's just the conditions that they're in. But a lot of it is there are fewer actors trained for the theater that don't project, that tend to really mumble and swallow their syllables. And if that's a losing battle right there. So if the actor is not, clear and projecting, it's definitely an uphill battle. We can clean it up. We can push as far as you can, but after a while you start pushing and it just sounds completely unnatural. And if it takes you out of the story, then it's like, what are we doing? So you have to really sort of balance all those judgments and see, what's going to be best. There's also the syndrome of, we're sitting in the mix room with the clients and we've all heard the lines 50, 60, 70, 80 times. We know what they're saying. So to really sort of like mentally sort of, try to clean your palate and go, I want to listen to this objectively and try to not, as like, I know what they're saying. Can we truly understand the words? And so, but it's a challenge.
Yeah. Talking of Walter Murch, I remember he told me when I first met him, I configured his film bench for Cold Mountain. And he told me that one of the reasons he stands up is that he likes to just be able to have that instant distance. And sometimes he said he would hit the space bar, walk out of the room and walk back in to see if something was working, because he wanted to see it sort of instinctively and hear it instinctively, rather than, just be this person almost with their head buried in a viewfinder, where you're just kind of experiencing it again. And like you say, 60, 70, 80 times. I also interviewed a guy recently who's a special effects supervisor, Richard Vandenberg, who worked on Andor. Actually, that's where I met him when I did that panel at Star Wars Celebration. And he said, jokingly, but I just want to set the record straight here, he said, sound guys hate us because of turbines, explosions, wind machines, all sorts of things. What's your feeling on the special effects work and sometimes the tracks that you get to work with that are recorded on set?
It's funny because, these things happen on sets, which need to happen because they need to, visually have, see the wind blowing in their hair or something. And we get these tracks back and, we say, okay, we're going to do that in ADR. And maybe we do it in ADR, or maybe the director says, no, I like that performance. I want to keep that performance. I don't care if it's noisy. So the dialogue editors spend all this time trying to strip out and clean it as much as possible without losing the integrity of the actor's voice. And then on the sound effects side, which is the side that I work on mostly, we're trying to put that noise back in, which is funny. It just happened on a project that we wrapped last week, where, we had an outdoor scene where there were birds and, basic outdoor ambience. But the dialogue mixer was like, can you do anything? And so I found, a wind track with a sort of a distant creek that was kind of roaring, and it just had enough movement in it to make it sound natural to try to cover up when you heard the dialogue come on and had that little burst of noise. So, we clean like crazy, and then we add noise, and then but we add the noise, so then the re-recording mixer has the ability to have those elements separate, so then they can add as much or take it out if needed. So it's a dance.
Yeah. As a last question, we've nearly been talking for an hour and a half here, Mac, which has seemed very easy. As a last question then, if you work in visual effects, I've spoken to people who say they want their work to kind of be invisible to a certain extent, because it's there to serve the story. It's there to not to distract you. Obviously, sometimes it can distract you, and it's there for a reason in doing so. I don't know what the audible version of invisible is, because we don't want to say inaudible because we still want to hear it. But how do you kind of work with that balance of trying to make something that stands out and continues to excite people both in and out of the industry to think, oh, that's some great work that they've done there sound wise, but at the same time trying to make sure that it doesn't stand out?
Yeah, it's very true. The exact same thing you said for VFX, for sound. If we kind of remain unnoticed, then we've done our job, which is frustrating at times, because you do want people to sort of take notice of your work. But again, it's really about the story. You're really trying to have them sucked into and immersed into that story and go on a journey. The thing I like to tell people is audience members are very savvy when it comes to music. Like if music is trying to manipulate their emotions. Yeah, if they hear the sad violins coming in, they're like, oh, okay, something sad's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But we can do those same things with sound to manipulate and sort of pull on those, imaginary levers inside someone's mind to make them feel something. You think of an outdoor suburban scene. If you put happy songbirds in, that's going to have one effect on the audience, versus if you have no happy songbirds and you only have crows. It's suddenly going to make people feel, oh, something's a little uneasy. But I'd say 9 out of 10 people aren't going to be like, oh, the sound people put crows in here where something weird's going to happen. A lot of people, like, as you said before, think that, oh, it's when the camera flipped on, that's what they're hearing, which is largely not true. We're touching every piece of audio and making so many artistic choices from moment to moment. And I like to tell filmmakers too, like, if you can craft your scene and let, sound help support that scene and leave the music out and get the audience to that natural emotion without music, but then have the music come in and respond and take that emotion to the next step, then that's really powerful. Because there is a tendency for, especially inexperienced filmmakers, to want to have music wall to wall. But after a while, if you have music wall to wall, it's not effective anymore. It's not doing anything.
It is a wall, yeah.
Exactly. So it's like finding those breaks and those moments to let the audience just sort of live with those characters and live with that moment, and also having a moment for no dialogue and maybe what is that character on the screen, what are they listening to or what are they hearing, and filtering the reality through that person, which suddenly gives us so many opportunities to maybe put things a little cattywampus or something it's a little off kilter, and help define the character by what they're hearing.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Mac there. Thanks, Mac, for giving your time to chat with me. I hope we can meet up sometime in the future. Coming up on the podcast, I'm still hoping to speak with Gareth Edwards about his sci-fi epic, The Creator. Gareth has been doing the press tour at the moment, and he's recently been quite unwell following that. So I'm hoping we can get a date booked in the coming weeks. I also want to speak to The Creator's production designer, James Klein. I'm hoping I can line that up soon as well. I've also got forthcoming episodes with creature creator Tom Spina, author John Walsh, and a Halloween special episode coming up at the end of this month, so in about a week's time, in which I'm back at the British Film Institute talking to Doug Weir and his colleague Vic Pratt about a spooky new release, as well as an in-depth chat about the amazing work they do there at the BFI. Please remember to check out the Patreon page, please leave a review, and please remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.